Welcome, everybody, to Soccer 101. My name is Taylor Rockwell, and I'm very excited to be here. I'm always excited to record 101, but I'm especially excited to record 101 when we're talking about the domestic leagues of countries that have qualified for the World Cup. There are many. We will probably not end up getting to all of them, but Graham Ruthven, we are at the very least getting to Qatar today.
That's right, and I know, Taylor, you're super excited for this episode where we have to pretend this whole thing isn't about sports washing somehow.
What's that?
And I don't know if you've heard of this thing. It's kind of a big deal, and
Is
Qatar
it?
are part of it. Yeah, that's right.
Did they get like a World Cup or something in totally legitimate fashion?
That's it. Yeah, I think that's what happened. There were no question marks against that tournament at all. And that is an interesting part of this entire episode, is how Qatar made such a big deal of hosting that World Cup, where they built up for that tournament, quite literally built up the country to host that tournament.
Well, they did, but other people did, yeah.
Yes, that is true. That's an important clarification. But and now kind of feels, in their whole sports washing journey, feels a bit directionless, and that extends to what's going on with the Qatar Stars League, which is the name of the domestic league in Qatar.
Yes, it is a really fascinating league. It's a really fascinating country, and I think there's a lot of really interesting geopolitical history that factors into the league itself, into that World Cup, and into their kind of programs for expansion and growth in sport, such as they are. I would say they are less strong than they were maybe a couple years ago when they were desperately trying to get everything ready and shining for the 2022 World Cup. But Graham, before we dive into all that, why are we talking Qatar? What are we doing here today? Take us through it.
So Qatar qualified for the 2026 World Cup through the fourth round of AFC qualifying. So there are a number of safety nets in this expanded format of the tournament. Basically the fourth round was two groups of 3 teams, right? It was 6 teams in total, 2 games in each group. And this was completely legitimate, and nobody was angry about it at all. But in one group was Saudi Arabia, and in the other group was Qatar. And it just happened, Taylor, just by chance, that Saudi Arabia played in one group. They played all their games at home, and then Qatar played all their games at home. And the two countries that either have hosted World Cups and have a close relationship with FIFA, or are going to host a World Cup in the future, they qualified through this fourth round. It's quite an incredible triumph for both of them. So that's why we're talking about Qatar.
Yeah.
Obviously, we're continuing this series of talking about the domestic leagues of countries that have qualified for the next summer's World Cup, and Qatar are next up on the list.
I mean, like, I'm nitpicking and probably going into the weeds too quickly, but I will say I did enjoy that those playoffs were meant to be at, like, quote-unquote neutral venues, and yet Saudi Arabia hosts Saudi Arabia's games, Qatar hosts Qatar's games, and it stands to reason that if they're both going to host anyway, you could just have Qatar playing Saudi Arabia and Saudi Arabia playing Qatar, but that would be problems unto itself, because they don't always get along, those two countries.
No, they don't.
But no, we don't need to talk about Saudi Arabia yet. We can instead talk about Qatar for a little while, Graham. And I think when we look at the history of football in Qatar, there is a lot of history. There's more history than I knew. I really enjoyed this episode. It's one of the ones where I knew like a little bit about it, but I think I knew less about this league than many of the other ones we have discussed, with the exception of like Uzbekistan and some of the ones we've done more recently. But football in Qatar dates back to the 60s, as I understand it. The Qatar Football Association formed in 1960. The first unofficial season in the league is 1963. The first official season is 1972. And I think when we're looking at dates, those are a few of them. But it seems like you can kind of codify it with pre-2003 and post-2003. And I can get more into that one when we get there. But Graham, anything about pre-2003 that stands out to you from Qatari football?
The fact that it was called the Q League for a long time, which I actually quite like. That's a good name. They should have kept that. It's much better than the Qatar Stars League or the Doha Bank Stars League, to give it its full corporate name. And yeah, I was also interested, Taylor, in how when you think of Qatar and football, you automatically think of the 22 World Cup, and how the narrative with that tournament was that Qatar didn't have a standing in the game. They weren't a traditional soccer nation, and I think that's still true to an extent. But you're right, their history in the game dates back to I found it went back as far as the 40s, when oil workers, when they discovered oil, and so you'd have expats, coming over to work in Qatar, and obviously they brought soccer with them from around the world. And in terms of the format, just now, just very quickly to do some table setting before we get into the history, and I think you're right. I think that early 2000s is a turning point for the league, so let's dive into that a little bit more. But some table setting, the current format right now is there's 12 teams in the league. It's a very short season. Every team plays 22 games, one home and one away against every other team. I think part of that is because they don't play through May, or obviously the heat of the prime of the summer because of the heat at that time of year. And then in terms of like how they hand out the trophies, it's very simple. The team that finishes top wins the title. The team that finishes bottom gets relegated, and then the team that finishes second bottom goes into a relegation playoff. And there are actually 4 divisions in Qatar, but below the first division, the Qatar Stars League, it is a largely amateur setup. And a lot of those top clubs, or the majority of the top clubs, are either owned by investment funds linked to the Emir. Al Sadd is owned by the brother of the Emir of Qatar, and then you've got Al Gharafa owned by a couple of sheikhs as well. So there's not a lot of like truly independent private enterprise at executive level, and that then leads to some of the investment that we've seen from these clubs, in particular at the start of the 21st century when they did, for a period, spend big on star names.
Yep. So let's talk about that time period, because prior to it, when you're looking at the league, they have like clubs launching, dissolving, changing names, moving. They intermittently have promotion and relegation. They intermittently have a second division. Sometimes they have both, but there's no pro-rel. I read that they suspended play for an entire year in an effort to qualify for the 1986 World Cup, which they ultimately do not. They introduced playoffs. They introduced shootouts to settle draws because they're trying to boost attendance. They're trying to boost interest. But it is, in 2003, the kind of key moment is the Qatari Football Association allocates $10 million to each, still named the Q League at the time, club, and that ushers in the arrival of the stars. That makes it the Qatar Stars League. The De Boer brothers, Romario, Pep Guardiola, Fernando Hierro, Marcel Desailly, Stefan Effenberg, Gabriel Batistuta, to name just a few. And Graham, if you'll permit me, I want to look at the Qatar, the history of Qatar for a moment, because I did not know any of this until researching this episode. But the key moment that sets up that decision in 2003 to fund football is in 1995. Sheikh Hamad bin Haifa Al Thani, deposes his father as emir and basically takes over control of the country in order to exploit their massive natural gas resources. By 2010, Qatar has the highest GDP per capita of any country in the world. But the new emir recognizes money alone is not going to secure survival. We are very small, population of around 180,000. We don't have a ton of influence in the region, certainly in the world. So how can we go about getting that influence with now the largesse we have? And it starts off with recognizing that the American military is a good thing to bet on. And so they build the very large Air Force base that is still very much in operation. 11,000 U.S. personnel are there, but that is critical. I believe in aspects of the first Gulf War, Qatar are very helpful in funding U.S. Troops and transport, but then also by the second Gulf War, they have the airfield. There's a huge involvement there. There's a lot of geopolitical connection that way. There's a lot of funding of arts and entertainment. Al Jazeera comes around at this point because of this money, because of a desire to have more say in the kind of global messaging and global communications. And so helping have your own news network that is largely pretty respected, I think helps with that. And then there's an idea that if you want to increase international prestige, you have the military connection, you have arts and entertainment, but also sports, tourism, and a cultural destination really helps. And so there is then this idea that we can become a place where we can establish a small league, we can bring in foreign players, we can create a lot of interest that way, but we can also start generating enthusiasm towards coming here, towards living here, towards visiting here, and all of that leads up to the 2022 World Cup as a way to kind of keep creating this cultural relevance and weaving Qatar into a lot of basically intersecting policies to increase their global profile. And so with that comes, we're going to fund football clubs similar to what we're seeing with Saudi Arabia now, or more recently, you have wealthy members of the royal family purchasing clubs or taking over clubs in Qatar and then starting to spend money and starting to kind of increase their profile that way. And then you obviously have the involvement in the international game as well, Graham. So that, I think, is how you get to 2003, where that money is spent and where the profile of the league takes a jump forward.
Yeah, and it seems like Qatar, we're seeing with a lot of the stuff that we're seeing Saudi Arabia do and the UAE and some other Gulf nations, it seems like Qatar were one of the first countries to be Western facing in that sense. And so in the early 2000s, when they bring in those players, I vaguely remember, the one that I remember is Pep going to Qatar. Like that, the Qatar, that was one that was on my radar. Batistuta as well, I think. That one I'd read about in World Soccer, that Gabriel Batistuta was playing in Qatar. And then from there, Qatar seemed to pivot somewhat, and they start the Aspire Academy, which is this $50 million multi-sports academy in Doha, and they really lean into that, and they try and build up the Qatari national team, and that kind of led to more of a domestic focus, and the focus on the league was sort of dropped.
Yep.
Certainly in the run-up to the World Cup. And since the World Cup, I'm not really sure they know what they're doing with the league or the national team or the Aspire Academy, which, to be fair, the Aspire Academy, we'll maybe come on to this a little bit later, that when we look at sort of the makeup of the national team, has been very successful for what Qatar needs it to be. But in terms of bringing the Stars to play in the Qatar Stars League, which they renamed the Stars League to highlight the fact that they had household names, I'm not really sure if they're doing that to such a great extent, certainly when you compare that to some of the other countries, primarily Saudi Arabia as one of their neighbours.
Yeah, I think that is, to me, one of the most interesting aspects of this whole episode, potentially, is that for the money put into it, for the World Cup they received, it doesn't seem like there is a ton of enthusiasm, and I'm speaking broadly. I'm sure there are people in Qatar who love football and want to see it grow, but it doesn't seem like there is a ton of enthusiasm or planning for competing with Saudi Arabia. Put it that way. It seems like Saudi Arabia is trying to kind of be that market leader, and Qatar, it seems like, are kind of content with where things are. Attendances are pretty poor, generally speaking. It's tough to find sort of accurate reflections of attendance. You will get capacity reported, stadium capacity, or tickets issued is another way to put that. But it seems like you'll get very mixed returns. Here's a good one from the David Goldblatt Seminal Volume, The Age of Football. It's great. Women and therefore children do not attend games. Qatari men remain indifferent to the point where one league game live on television really did appear to have just a single spectator in a stadium for 25,000. Even the arrival of a player of the caliber of Xavi Hernandez in 2015 required migrant workers to be paid to go to the stadium to welcome him. Indian workers were taught to chant songs in Arabic that they did not understand. So there's an idea that, like, you have a small population, there is quite a bit of wealth there. Maybe not everybody wants to go sit in a stadium for an hour and a half and watch their domestic team that might not be the highest quality.
Yeah, I certainly echo Taylor, you saying that it was difficult to find attendance data, which then makes me think the league wants to hide the fact that not many people are going to these games. I did find one article from a couple of seasons ago that said Al Sadd, one of the clubs, was averaging 1,500 fans per game, and Al...
What a nice round number that is, huh?
Yeah. Al Dual, they were averaging just over 1,000 fans per game, so there's another round number for you. And it does seem like those numbers will grow for some of the rivalry games that they have. So there was 10,000 fans at a game between Al Ahly, not that one, the Qatari one, and Qatar Sports Club last year. And I went and found some highlights of that game, and the stands did seem to have fans in them. So I could believe that. But it seems like this is definitely one of the lower attended leagues that we have covered in this series so far. And I guess that's to be expected to a certain extent, because Qatar, still a very small country, even though they've grown a lot from that point of, what did you say, Taylor, 160,000, 180,000 people? Yeah. It's now around 2.5 million. They have a very large expat population. Still a very small country. What is interesting about the stadiums that these teams play in and where they're getting these small attendances is, out of 12 teams in the Qatar Stars League, only 3, that I could see anyway, only 3 play in stadiums that hosted World Cup games in 2022. The rest are much more modest, less impressive stadiums, which means there's 5 huge World Cup level stadiums in a country of 2.5 million people not being used to host any regular soccer. That's not wasteful at all. No,
not at all. I mean, I think it still does speak to the idea that they want to be more of like a regional hub than anything else, and so they want to host neutral site World Cup playoffs and the like, and they want to host Super Cup games, and I think that's maybe what they're aiming for, but not really helping.
And they need 9 stadiums, all I presume cost over $1 billion to build, and with attendance
they're all like within eyesight of each other.
Yeah, they need that to do those sort of things. To host the Italian Super Cup once a year.
I mean, how do you turn that down? The tournament that people don't really want to watch and aren't that interested in? Let's do it. I mean, it is also, I think, largely I'm coming at this with more cynical, I think, than I normally am for some of these episodes, because I think generally we approach it with, we want to learn more about this country, and yeah, there might have been some negative history, some turbulent history, some sports washing, what have you, but there is still interest and enthusiasm and people that love these teams, and I'm assuming that there are in Qatar, but speaking to those attendance figures and speaking to the way these teams are kind of built and then followed, it also kind of seems like there isn't as much like genuine love for some of these domestic sides. It feels like it is more the international game, like the big European clubs tend to be where there is a much more rabid following, and you have a ton of love for Barcelona and, by contrast, Real Madrid. Obviously, there are connections between Qatar and Barcelona, connections between Qatar and PSG. So I think in that, like, you have the domestic league that is playing a role in bringing players through and giving national team players an opportunity to play. A vast majority, if not almost entirely, like the recent national team call-up is playing domestically in Qatar for 4 or 5 different clubs. Like, generally, there's a big spread there, but it is a few clubs that tend to dominate. But it still just doesn't seem like there is as much organic enthusiasm for growth.
Yeah. And I think some of that might be cultural. And I have a little bit of kind of on-the-ground knowledge here. So background here, I was offered a job for the Qatar World Cup out of university. I thought about it. I had a couple interviews. It was good money for a kid coming out of... And I would be flying around the world and flying to the US. So it was an attractive job. And ultimately, I did turn it down, not to make myself out to be holier than thou because of everything that was around. Yeah. I couldn't help thinking about me sitting across from, at the time I was doing some work for the New York Times, and Andrew Das was like my guy at the New York Times, and I was thinking, man, I'm going to have to sit across from Andrew and like defend Qatar, and I just couldn't do it. But anyway, the reason I got offered that job was it was someone that I knew who did take a job there in a senior position. And so I'll speak to him every so often. I'm still in fairly regular contact with him. And I'll talk to him about what's it like to live in Qatar. He likes living out there, but he says that there's not a lot of sort of collective experience. So there are certain places, like if you go to the Old Town in Doha on a Friday night or Saturday night, yes, there'll be a bit of hubbub. If you go to some of the bars in some of the big hotels in Doha on a Friday or Saturday night, they'll obviously be filled with Westerners, but nonetheless, there'll be some activity there. But in terms of things like sporting events, which obviously Qatar has tried to lean into, but for the native population, the people that live there, the residents of Doha and Qatar, it's just not really much. It's not really within the culture to go out and have that collective enjoyment of it of an event. And I think that then leans into how a lot of these games and a lot of these stadiums are empty for these matches. There may be people watching on TV. That is maybe how these games are consumed. But in terms of the atmospheres, everything that I've seen is pretty flat.
I think, from my reading, there is much more of an emphasis on your local community or like community groups that you might belong to. So you might not be going out to bars and restaurants, you might not be going to sport, but you might be going to like your local cultural center where they're going to have family evenings where you will have 1,000 people there, but it's certainly not sport related, and it's certainly not incentivizing people to watch football. You don't have, big projectors up showing a game or anything like that. And again, when you do have women and therefore children not really involved, not really attending, I think that also immediately kind of cuts down on the growth of the game and the interest therein. So it's a strange situation for a country that has spent so much money on the infrastructure, obviously, but as we've already talked about, has also spent a lot of money on big name players and still does. So we look at, say, Al Sadd, you mentioned them previously, the most successful team in the Qatari League all time, 18 titles, including 4 of the last 5. They currently employ Roberto Firmino, Roman Saiz, Mohamed Kamara. They've employed plenty of big names in the past, and they are the only Qatari team to win the AFC Champions League. They did it twice, once in 1989, once in 2011. Plenty of domestic players as well. 5 players with the current national team in these November friendlies. We're recording in November 2025. But Akram Afif, who's only 28 years old, still very much around, still very much part of that national team. 120 caps for Qatar, plays for Al Sadd. So you have domestic residents, and then you also have the foreign talent coming in still.
Yeah, and a couple other names that listeners will have heard of. Julian Draxler plays for Al Ahly, not that one. Marco Verratti plays for Al Dual. Joselu, remember him? The guy who basically won a Champions League for Real Madrid that one season. That was weird. He's at Al Gharafa. So yeah, there's a good number of star players. And just going back, I guess a further generation, or maybe even 2 generations. We've mentioned Batistuta and Xavi Hernandez, you mentioned Taylor, but Wesley Sneijder played for Al Gharafa, Samuel Eto'o played for Qatar Sports Club, Desailly, I think you mentioned him in your list. Santi Cazorla played for El Sadd and is now back in La Liga with Real Oviedo, so that's an interesting one. But yeah, there's definitely 2 sides to this league. There's a domestic side, there's then the star players, and if you look at a lot of the all-time records, a lot of the all-time scorers are actually active players. So Sebastian Soria is a Uruguayan-born Qatari international, has scored 211 goals in the Qatar Stars League. He's played for 5 different teams in the league. You've then got Baghdad Bunja. He's at number 3 on the list. He's an Algerian international who's currently at Al Shamal. And what I find interesting about some of the guys who have been around for a while who are on these all-time lists is it says something about how the focus of Qatar as a national team shifted, because a lot of them will be Qatari internationals but are maybe Uruguayan-born or South American-born, and for a long time when Qatar got the World Cup, that seemed like what they were going to do was they were going to bring a lot of players in who maybe hadn't been capped by other nations but were good enough to play for Qatar, have them in the league until such a point that they could naturalise them and play for the national team. And so a bunch of those guys, if you look through those lists, are in that list. But actually, somewhere along the line, they leaned more into the Aspire Academy side of things.
I think it was when FIFA said, hey, you can't do that, right? And that we will start changing the rules.
But they
to
did
make
for
sure
a
that
long
you don't
time.
do that. I know.
Yeah, I think they changed the rules.
But I think there was specifically an Algeria to Qatar pipeline where you had a lot of players moving for a lot of money to Qatar and then suddenly playing for the Qatar national team. And I think FIFA, for a period of time, wanted to cut down on the growth of Qatari football in that particular way.
I remember being fascinated by that story when Qatar got the World Cup. It was like, man, we're going to see an entirely different interpretation of international football here, where Qatar are going to have a competitive team full of South American-born players or African-born players. It didn't quite materialise at the 2002 World Cup, but yeah, there are definitely names in this league that listeners will be familiar with. What's interesting is the rules are fairly loose compared to the Saudi Pro League in terms of registering foreign players. Clubs can register any foreigners. I'm reading from the website here. Clubs can register any foreigners they have over the course of the season, provided that 2 of them do not exceed the age of 23. So I know that still means that you can't go out and sign like fully fledged players in their peak, but compared to the Saudi Pro League, where we've seen a lot of clubs rifling through foreign stars because, 5 players that they're allowed? 6 players in the Saudi Pro League? It feels like there's a little bit more scope for Qatari teams to get those players in.
Yeah, and there are some interesting provisions in there that I do enjoy, including I think there's a specific carve-out for international players. You can have 1 or 2 Palestinian players, so you can kind of help grow the game in Palestine and support Palestinian players. I think you have like regional and confederation like openings as well in slots, but then it does seem like they've kind of gone I think like the Indian League did this, where they had like the star player and then like the secondary star player, but like you get that first wave of players and they're all names, and then the second one is sort of like, oh yeah, that guy, like he was good at AFCON or something. Like there's usually a slight bit of a drop-off as opposed to Saudi, where it's like the top 6 names are all being paid $100 million and are global superstars.
Yeah, I didn't know about the Palestine rule. That's really interesting. Right. Obviously, Qatar being a mediator in those talks for a long time, so there's a relationship between the countries. Didn't know that.
Yeah. So, Graham, do we feel like overall is the league getting better? That's the big question. My like sub question to start this, and it's kind of a big one, and I'm kind of putting you on the spot. But like since the 1990s, since like the mid 90s, early 90s, whatever you want to go with, like what league do you think where maybe it wasn't a footballing hotbed or known to be a successful soccer country has grown the most and had the most stability? And is it Major League Soccer?
Yeah, it's MLS by a million miles.
And by contrast, which one has like gone full Icarus and spent all the money, flown close to the sun, and then crashed and burned? I'm assuming China
or Scotland. If we're looking at the 90s, like
yeah, maybe it's that. Maybe it's that. But no, but like you all invented football. Like it's been a part of your history for a long time. I think when I look at like the countries that are trying to grow and trying to become part of the soccer world, so to speak. Like it's probably China is one that I would look at as being
China
not successful. I'd say Australia is maybe in the middle to more successful. Saudi Arabia, it's kind of, I would say maybe too soon, but it does seem like they're very soon going to be supplanting Major League Soccer as the most successful one. Where would you put Qatar in that range on that scale?
Oh, I mean, that's a difficult question to answer because even when Qatar were bringing in star players in the early 2000s, it never felt like they were doing the Saudi thing or even the MLS thing of being like, we want to be the top disrupting league in world soccer. It kind of felt like they were going through the motions. Like, certainly recently it's felt like Qatar is just going through the motions of, well, we've got the money, so we might as well spend it. But there's no overarching... vision, plan or ambition or vision for this league. So I find that question very difficult to answer. I mean, in terms of whether it's gotten better or worse, I think largely it's sort of remained the same. Maybe shaded worse in terms of the quality. It just feels like others around them, particularly Saudi Arabia, but even UAE and some other nations like the J League, I guess, if we're talking about Asian leagues, or the A League in Australia, obviously counted as an Australian, an Asian country in AFC. Just feels like Qatar's lost ground to a lot of these leagues that do have a clearer vision and have been able to have sustained success. And you see that in the AFC Champions League, right? Like Al Sadd won it in 2011.
Dude, did you look into that at all? I have to jump in for a moment.
Know.
Oh man,
Go on.
Neither did I. This is from the Age of Football, the David Goldblatt book as well. Because I had that too, and I was like, well, they won in 2011, so that must be a sign that they've like started to figure things out. Here you go. The team only entered the tournament after a Vietnamese club had been excluded for technical reasons. Their play was defensive and mean-spirited, and though they lost both legs of their quarterfinal, they still went through. The winning Iranian team, Sepahan, had a victory turned into a 3-0 defeat when it was revealed they had fielded an ineligible player, whereupon Al Sadd went through on goal difference. The semifinal against Suwon Blue Wings featured a great deal of time wasting and gamesmanship when the Qataris failed to return possession to the Koreans after the ball had been deliberately put out to attend to an Al Sadd injury. The game descended into a brawl. But as Qatar recently awarded the 2022 World Cup, they knew very well an unpopular victory is still a victory. So they win the whole thing, but like by one team getting disqualified and then another team having to forfeit a game. It's a little confusing.
So it wasn't quite Spain at the 2010 World Cup. It wasn't a triumph of game model or anything like that.
Not quite.
I think they have. Al Sadd won it, I think, in
the
like 89 or something as well. So that says to me that there was some sort of level. It just feels like they've been overtaken by other countries. In terms of comparing it to the Saudi Pro League, I went to Opta's team rankings. Opta thinks the Saudi Pro League is just fundamentally stronger. Al Sadd were the only Qatari team that made any sort of impression, and they would have been, in this ranking, they're the 11th best team in Saudi Arabia. I then, as I always do with these episodes, I compared it to MLS. Opta said every MLS team is better than every Qatari team, so it seems like the quality maybe isn't the highest.
That's, I guess, not surprising, but still kind of surprising. You look at their form in the Champions League this year, I believe no one made it past the quarterfinals. The season before, none were even in the knockout round. The season before that, Al Duhal made the semifinals. They lost 7-0 to Al Hilal from Saudi Arabia. So I think further emphasizing Graham's point that maybe Saudi Arabia is taking the lead here. It is still leading to a stronger national team, generally speaking, I think, than we've had from Qatar. They have qualified for the World Cup, obviously, albeit an expanded one. They host the one in 2022, so, grain of salt on qualification there. But for a country that did not qualify for a very long time and even suspended their league in an effort to try to qualify, it does feel like they have made that leap in terms of where they are in Asian qualifying and Asian strength, that we would assume they will still be in and around the conversation for World Cup places pretty consistently, albeit maybe in like having to go the playoff route at times.
Yeah, for sure. They have definitely made a leap forward. I mean, they have won the last two Asian Cups. Like, they're the defending Asian champions, which is a little bit of an anomaly, but they are definitely at that level where, as the fact proves that they've won it twice, like they can feasibly stay competitive against the best nations in Asia. And if you look at the national team, the Qatari national team, I mean, the Stars League, the domestic league, just has a huge footprint on that team. They called up 26 players for a friendly match as we're recording this in November 2025. All 26 currently play for Qatari teams. In fact, Qatar haven't called up a single player from outside the Qatar Stars League in the last 3 years that I could find. It might be even longer than that, but the records that I was able to find only went back 3 years. So yes, the domestic league has been hugely influential in the national team, but I think even more influential has been the Aspire Academy that I mentioned. So many of the current national team have come through that facility and that programme. There was a pretty big shift by Qatar about 12, 13 years out from hosting the World Cup, when they really invested in that facility. I remember Tim Cahill was lead soccer, director, football technical director of Aspire
Lead
Academy.
Soccer Cahill, I think he was.
Yeah, that was his official title. But when you look at how a country of 2.5 million people has grown a generation of players that can hold its own at the top of Asian football, I think that's worth something. I mean, obviously the money is a factor there, but that's not nothing. Qatar were absolute no-hopers 20 years ago. They were a team that the US or Scotland or whoever would hope to smash 7 or 8 or 9-0 in a game, and that's just not the case now. You would hope that, well, I would certainly hope Scotland and the US would beat Qatar, but it would be competitive, and so they have come quite a long way in a short period of time.
I think, though, of that 2 million, 3 million population, I think 90% of it is expat non-Qatari nationals. You have a huge population. I think Qatari citizens are only 11% of that. So with that in mind, it's an even smaller pool that they are pulling from.
Yeah, that's right.
And that really does put it into greater context, Graham, that though there has been a ton of money, you have to spend a ton of money if you want to go to a World Cup and be a competitive team, or even a semi-competitive team. And if you want a league that is even, half good compared to some of the leagues we've talked about. And it is, we talk about it with Iceland, with their population when they qualify for the Euros, how it's a small miracle. When we talk about the success Croatia has had at the international level, I think they have a population around 3 million, and that is of Croatians, not 10% of that 3 million. So you're right. I think I am being maybe more down on Qatar than I expected to be, and I think putting that into my frame of view, I now realize maybe I don't need to be so down, because in reality they've actually punched above their weight quite a little bit.
Yeah, and I mean, just when you mention Iceland there, yeah, it was a bit of a fairy tale what Iceland did. Do you know what they also did? They spent a whole load of money on facilities. So it's just difficult to have a fairy tale, quote-unquote fairy tale, in modern soccer without somewhere along the line there being investment. And yes, we can quibble with the source of Qatar's money, but the way that they've spent it has definitely moved the needle for them. Maybe not so much in terms of their league, but certainly in terms of their national team. And it seems like the league is of a standard that is competitive enough for them not to have a massive drop-off when they go into the national team arena and are then playing some of the better teams in Asian football. They're still of a level where they can be competitive.
Graham, any other points on the Q League, the Qatar Stars League, the Qatar Bank Stars League, Bank of Qatar money, oil and gas?
Just kind of interested to see what they do over the next, I guess, few decades. What is the Qatar's vision, and we can broaden this out to what is their vision in sports. It feels like the World Cup was such a moment of culmination for them, and since then it doesn't really seem like they have a clear vision. At some point, I'd imagine that will change, and they will have. I think they want an Olympics. I'm sure I read that they want to use a lot of the facilities for the World Cup in an Olympic Games. So maybe that's the next thing. Maybe there will be a knock-on for the Qatar Stars League where they do start to invest in more of those teams. But for the time being, it just kind of feels like they're coasting a little bit until that vision becomes apparent.
I think that's it. It feels a bit like they thought we'll get the 2022 World Cup. We'll start signing stars in the early 2000s. We'll keep doing that. And we'll be a solid regional player with like global connections due to the World Cup. And maybe didn't fully expect or didn't anticipate at all that Saudi Arabia would start to spend the money they are spending to develop their league, to bring in the players they are, and ultimately get a World Cup, which we assume they will in 2034. And that really does kind of dwarf Qatar in a number of different ways, and probably does require a little bit of a recalculation and things being in stasis until they can figure out the next steps.
Yeah, and Saudi Arabia in a lot of ways have just sort of dwarfed what Qatar have been able to do. Qatar got a World Cup. Guess who's got a World Cup now in 2034? Oh, you've got some star players in your league? Yeah, we've got more star players, more relevant star players. You've got an F1 race? Yeah, we've got a better F1 race. It's towards the end of the season now. Like it just feels like of the in the sports washing battle, and obviously there is some geopolitical tension between these two nations. It just feels like Saudi Arabia has the upper hand right now, and you're right. Maybe Qatar's been blindsided in that sense.
I will forever point to like the day after the Qatar World Cup ends, Gianni Infantino moves out of the house that he was given in Qatar and moves to Saudi Arabia, where he is given a new house. That does feel very representative of the way things have gone in recent history. But Graham Ruthven, thank you for talking about the Qatari League, which does, we should note, I think 7 of the top 10 goal scorers all time are still playing, some of them still in that league. It does feel like a league that has potential for growth, but is going to be kind of staying in that range of like playing when it's within its region, still having some talent, still not growing maybe leaps and bounds the way they might like to, but staying in their lane for the time being. Albeit with some success along the way. So congratulations to Qatar for qualifying for a World Cup instead of just hosting one. Graham Ruthven, I hope your national team qualifies for the World Cup as well, or maybe you could just use your massive natural gas resources to host a World Cup.
I mean, do you want to get in that? We do have large natural oil resources. It's just Westminster takes it all for themselves, and this is a large part of the Scottish independence movement. But we'll keep that for another episode.
If only you all had some sort of referendum where you could have voted to separate.
If only, Taylor. If only.
If only. Well, Graham Ruthven, thank you for that Scotland knowledge and your Qatar knowledge, my friend.
Thank you, Taylor Rockwell.
Listeners, thank you all so much for listening as always. We hope you enjoyed this one, and we'll talk to you again.